Shri Siti Abdurrahim, Dr. M. Bashir, Principal Jyoti, my friend Dr. Ashley, and friends. As Ashley said, I've been planning to come to Dayapuram for nearly a decade now. And for one reason or another, I haven't been able to come. I'm really, really delighted to be here today. And I'm very grateful to Ashley and to everyone here for giving me the privilege of saying a few words at this celebration of this very great man. Let me just say that it gives me particular pleasure to be here because Dayapuram is an educational institution, a school, a college created with love and goodwill. And I spent pretty much my whole working life teaching the history of modern India, modern colonial India, in Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi. So colleges and universities and educational institutions are very close to my heart. And I'm especially honored to be here at this time when we celebrate M.T. Vasudevan Nair, because there is a sense in which M.T. belonged to a class of writer that doesn't fit within the conventional categories of criticism and literary appreciation. And he doesn't because he's too large for these categories. You know, when we think of some writers from this subcontinent, you know, I'm thinking of Iqbal, Tagore, Shivram Karanth, M.T. There's a word for them in the English language which is protean, P-R-O-T-E-A-N, which basically just means writers who encompass almost everything. Their creative imaginations are not confined to fiction or to a literary medium. Tagore, for example, famously, late in life became an artist. He created a whole category of music, Rabindra Sangeet. He restored a great dance form, which is a classical dance form, Manipuri. And this is, of course, even before we begin to talk about his contribution to literally remaking Bangla as a language, his great novels, his great short stories, his philosophical reflections, his debates with Mahatma Gandhi on nationalism. Tagore was someone who remade the world around him. I think of the great Kannada writer Shivram Karanth. My father was from Karnataka. Karanth, again, is a Tagore-like figure, someone whose work is not confined to one genre, whether it's fiction or poetry or drama or film, who encompasses all of this and who works not just as a single writer for his own gratification, but someone who urgently wishes to engage with the world around him, who has ideas that he wishes to see become alive in the world. And I think M.T. Vasudevan Nair is a person in that class of creative minds. And, you know, I shouldn't have the presumption to speak of him at all, because the only thing that connects me to the world of Malayalam is my surname, which is Kesavan. You know, all my life I've had people walk up to me and speak to me in Malayalam, which I do not know. My father was from Karnataka, originally from Tamil Nadu, which is why he has the name Kesavan. My mother was from North India. And because I grew up in Delhi, I never learnt any of the many South Indian languages that my father spoke. My father used to say he speaks his mother's tongue, not his mother tongue. But I do want to say something about M.T. precisely from the point of view of an outsider, someone who is not of Kerala, but someone who's interested in writing. Dr. Bashir spoke about the solitary, isolated novel that I wrote many years ago. And I think one of uh, one of the things that I want to say as an outsider brought up in Delhi in two languages, in Hindi and in English, as someone who has attempted to write fiction and non-fiction in English, I just wanted to say that one of the great tragedies of Indian writing certainly was the overvaluation. You know, there was a moment in the 80s and 90s when the overvaluation of fiction written in English by Indians, good though it was, seriously distorted our understanding of what it meant to be an Indian writer. You know, famously, there was this anthology of Indian fiction, allegedly, that Salman Rushdie compiled. This is in the late 1990s. And he called it the Penguin Anthology of Indian Fiction. Not Indian fiction in English, but Indian fiction. And I think the only Indian writers represented in it were Manto and Satyajit Ray, which these were very great men, but you will agree that for the rest of the book to be made up of Indian writers in English represents just a distortion of the many habitats and the many worlds created by really great writers. I'm reminded of an occasion in 2002. There was a literary festival in France and organized by the government of France, and its focus was Indian writing. So this gathering was filled with the most extraordinary names. You know, Nirmal Verma, who was the great short story writer and novelist in Hindi. There's Mahashweta Devi, the great Bengali writer. There was U.R. Ananthamurthy from Karnataka. And the organizers of this literary festival in France, because they were basically familiar with Indian writers who wrote in English because of the exposure that these writers got, asked Amitav Ghosh, who was also present, named him, in a sense, the leader of this Indian delegation. To his great credit, Amitav was deeply embarrassed by this. He was completely mortified by this, and he got up and said that, you know, thank you for asking me to do this, but for me to do this in the company of such extraordinary writers of such distinction would just be presumption. And then, of course, in his graceful way, U.R. Ananthamurthy got up and said that you can tell from this that Amitav is a very well-mannered young man. And the two of them, in a sense, tided over the small embarrassment that this might have created. But as an outsider then to Kerala, as an outsider to MT's work, I just want to say that when we celebrate writers like Mahashweta Devi, U.R. Ananthamurthy, M.T. Vasudevan Nair, Iqbal, Tagore, what we also celebrate are the public spheres, the print cultures that create these people and that are created by these people. One of the great glories of our country is that we are not a nation in any ordinary sense of the word. We are, in a sense, a great subcontinental civilization that is not defined by any one principle, any one creed, any one language, or any one idea. There are, of course, people who disagree with this, who disagree with the fundamental pluralism and diversity of India. But nonetheless, the reality and the truth of our lives is that regardless of whether you're in Delhi or Calcutta or Bangalore, your life, in a way, is impacted by the imagination of people like M.T. Vasudevan Nair. As someone who taught the history of India, the history of colonial India especially, throughout my life, one of the things that strikes you about M.T. is his, and this is particularly true for historians, is his extraordinary intensity with which he engages with the politics of India. You know, he had a very long life from the 1930s up to last year. And in a sense, his critical response from everyone to Jawaharlal Nehru to Narendra Modi is a really striking feature. You know, sometimes we take this for granted. But in most literary cultures, you don't find creative people who write fiction, for example, necessarily engaging with the larger political world around them. necessarily engaging with, not just addressing a literary elite, but engaging with both the political sphere and a mass audience. So one of the things that strikes someone like me when I look at MT's oeuvre is just how much he wrote. I mean, it's completely staggering. When you look at people like Karanth and Tagore and MT, you think, did they write with both their hands and both their feet for 24 hours of the day? How can you produce an oeuvre like this? You know, we think of him as someone who started as a teacher, was a great editor and journalist and publisher. And we haven't even got to the things that made him such a titan in Kerala. The screenplays, the films, and above all, the fiction, the novels, the essays, the things he wrote. And this is what is truly extraordinary about him. This ability to be both a meditative, interior person and a person who consistently and constantly addresses the world. There are, I, like everybody else, have favorite films and favorite novels. And one of my favorite films is a film by Satyajit Ray called Jolshaghar. It's a story about a very cultured zamindar who has fallen into bad days, and he decides to stage a final mehfil, a final performance, which of course in the film is performed by Begum Akhtar, who at that point of time was called Akhtari Bai Faizabadi. And it basically pictures a feudal world, a very cultivated, sophisticated feudal world in decay. Similarly, there's a great novel by Lampedusa, a great Italian novel by Lampedusa called The Leopard, which again deals with the same transition from tradition to modernity. And in Kerala, you have M.T. Vasudevan Nair chronicling through his work the evolution of an extraordinarily unique set of social cultures, which consists of matrilineal, which consists of a joint family, which consists of ecologically a very dense world being transformed, not always for the better, by modernity and progress. And for a single writer to attempt this task, to do this with multifarious other responsibilities, is something that we shouldn't take for granted, something that we should marvel at. The other thing that strikes me about him is that it's almost impossible to think of anyone who worked in these two registers with such success, both rigorously literary fiction and someone who also addressed a mass audience through cinema, someone who, even though he was born in the 1930s, immediately saw the potential of cinema as a form both of entertainment and instruction and understanding. But I think if I was to say the most important thing in my mind about M.T. Vasudevan Nair, especially standing as we do at the cusp of ecological catastrophe in 2025, is his prescience as a chronicler of the environment. You know, one of the great, Amitav Ghosh has written on this, one of the great challenges in front of writers of novels and fictions is that you live in a world that is being destroyed by the human beings who live in it. And the climate catastrophe is not a question of whether, it is a question of when. How does a writer begin to talk about this? How does a writer of fiction begin to talk about this without becoming boring, without becoming merely a teacher, without being someone who is merely dealing with it in an issue-based way? And I'm reminded of, there's the great opening lines of M.T.'s epic of the Mahabharata from the point of view of Bhim. And I can only read them in translation because I don't have Malayalam. I'd just like to read a paragraph to you to demonstrate how uncannily M.T. actually seems to visualize one of the great destructive episodes of climate change, which is a kind of tsunami. I'll just read this great opening paragraph, which is, this is the destruction of Dwarka. So he says, the sea was black, the waves dashed against the shore, screaming, as if devouring the palace and the great city of Dwarka had not sated their hunger. In the distance, at a spot that must have marked the crest of the Victory Pavilion of the old palace, the water was now still. In front of it, the slanting head of a tall, majestic pillar rose high. The small stone structures of the ramparts dotted the shore beneath as far as the eye could see. Vestiges of Dwarka's old splendor, which the deluge had masticated and spat out, lay scattered on the wet sand of the shore, like the lifeless bodies of thousands of animals lying on a sacrificial site. It's one of the great literary openings in the history of the novel. The other thing I'd like to say in terms of his prescient awareness of and his ability to, in a sense, meld the environment not just as landscape in a novel, but as a living presence, is, of course, the way in which the river of his home, Nila, becomes a part of his fiction, not just as a view or a scenery, but as something that constitutes the people within it. I've just been reading a great contemporary book by Robert Macfarlane, which is called Is a River Alive? And Macfarlane argues in this book that a river is not just a resource to be exploited, but it has to be recognized as an autonomous living entity. And it should be recognized as this, not just in the imagination, but also in law. And I think it's extraordinary for us sitting here to realize that MT had, through some extraordinarily imaginative leap, reached this position in his work, internalized it in his fiction, years before it became a fashionable part of cosmopolitan discourse. Finally, I'd just like to say that what most strikes me as an inhabitant of North India, which, as you know, is in many ways the staging ground of the great, how shall I put this, the great majoritarian disease of our time. What is striking about M.T. Vasudevan Nair, and we saw this eloquently testified to by both Dr. Bashir and Ashley, the breadth of his sympathies, the variety of his commitments to people regardless of their identities, this old-fashioned sense that there were causes in the world that had nothing to do with identity. And that, the normal opposition is between identity and humanity. But in the case of MT, even humanity is too small a category, because for MT is concerned with the non-human as well. He's concerned with the natural world. This breadth of sympathy, this ability to emphasize not the things that divide us, but the necessity of our interconnected lives, is what all of us in this room and this country should give thanks for. Thank you.